All right, welcome back, everyone. Harriet and I are glad to be back for another discussion of church law and finance. But as always, Harriet, how was? I guess you and I we talked a little bit about your weekend. So,
Yes.
how is the week starting off?
Good afternoon, everyone. My week has started off like how my life goes. It's crazy busy, and I am tired. Most people rest on the weekends. It seems like sometimes I work 10 times harder. And then we come back on Monday and try to figure it out. Jeffrey had an event this weekend. Gospel artist Kim Burrell had a 50th birthday party in Maryland. She loves Jeffrey's cooking, so her team wanted to surprise her by having Jeffrey come up and cater the food for that event. So we took a trek to Brandywine, Maryland. Served about 150 people. Did that. That was great. They had some gospel heavyweights. I don't like the name drop, but it's a Kim Burrell birthday party. So we talking Donnie McClurkin and Juanita Bynum and Vanessa Bell Armstrong and Crystal Rucker, and I could go on, Jason Nelson, I could go on and on and on and on. But it was fantastic. They have all been, a lot of them have Jeffrey's food. The ones that didn't, now they have, so they understand why Country Boy Kitchen is phenomenal. and but we did a 8-hour round trip thing, rode up there, served, rode back, and so we're approaching 40. That road trip life is college. I told Jeff we need some jets, and we got to fly up here. And if we're gonna be doing this, because he's getting invited all over the place, LA and New York, bro, you got to fly. You cannot be driving and coming right back. So that's my weekend.
I think that is a big thing, especially like when you're driving to go do some work. It's not like you're just driving to show up and be the guest of honor. Like you're
Mm-mm.
driving to work,
Yeah.
then serve, and then drive back. Like that's a
No,
lot.
work, serve, and then we clean because we gonna leave your place better than we found it. And then we came back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That does add up. So I am glad you guys made it back safely.
Yeah.
A almost a down and back trip, within 24 hours?
Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah. We left at 10 o'clock and came back on a Saturday and got back 6 o'clock on a Sunday. That's 20 hours.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a productive 20 hours.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. It was good.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you are doing well. One of the things that I did this weekend is I've been doing some, like Friday I had a call with the church in North Carolina, meeting with their pastors. They wanted to talk about they want to talk about some tax topics for our ministers. And so one of the things I can say is a lot of people are tuning into the show and asking questions because I think the topics that we're bringing up are really causing people to really think twice about some of these things that what many of them have said is, hey, I didn't learn this in seminary, or hey, they didn't teach us that in seminary, or whatever the case may be. So really excited about, like I said, the topics that we talk about. And today we're talking about another topic of just that, separation between the business and the church. Because
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of people who have, different perspectives on that. Because one of the questions that came up, like as I was giving the ministers on that call some context about, hey, here are some tax things to consider. Now, I was very clear to say, hey, when you're working with the person who does your taxes,
Right.
here's some questions to ask. And one of the things that it made me realize, like when some of the questions they were asking, is like, man, I wonder if, what if people think that, hey, the person, if we have a good CPA handling our church, then, hey, that CPA can also be the personal accountant for the ministers as well. And I'm like, that probably comes up on the legal side. So I'm like, we should probably have a conversation about that.
Yeah, it's definitely warranted. I have learned through in my own personal life of, I'm gonna call it trial and error, but real life. My personal opinion is that it should be separate. Your third party, they should be third party. Your financial person, your CPA, your legal counsel, they should be third party for a couple of reasons. Um, I love, for me, I'm a believer. So when I go into these churches and I'm a believer, I like working with other believers. For me being on the inside, I just learned way too much information about a ministry, and to the point where I don't want to cause a conflict or compromise my law license, because now I'm in too deep. I can't advise you on this as an attorney. Do we have attorney-client privilege? If this was to get exposed, could this be a problem for me or the ministry? So I'd rather be third-party neutral, personal experience. Because I've had to give advice that says in writing, hey, for professionally, you need to do so and so and so and so, and I'm going to recuse myself from this. We was at a church recently. We just were on a church, and they asked me, did I want to be on the board? We were down in Georgia, and I said, no, I do not. I don't want to be on your board, but I will advise your board. You know what I mean? So I think that the separation is good. You talked about the giving CPA services to the church and tax advice to the minister or staff. No, they need to go get their own tax advice. So if something comes up, it doesn't all relate to one person. Checks and balances. And I think that people can do both and do it well. But if something were to come up, it's really good to have an extended arm's length transaction with a third party who's neutral to the ministry. Personal opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, when it comes down to finance, I think it's always great to have checks and balances in place, because the issues, or let's say the situation where issues have come up, where finances have gone awry, or there have been just these different situations that have happened, a lot of times there just wasn't any separation of control, or there were no separation of duties as it pertains to the finances. And sometimes unknowingly a situation got created that had an objective third party been looking at this, then hey, it probably would have been caught before it became a problem. So I mean, I totally agree with you, and I want to dive into like some of the actual scenarios. And I would say I'm not sharing any names for anyone that's listening. We're not sharing any names about, hey, this church or this minister. It's more sharing the situation, because what I find is that a lot of churches may face these type of situations. Like one in particular is like from I think let's talk a little bit more about what you mentioned about the board, to where, let's say, a church hires someone to do a legal assessment or an accounting assessment. And the question comes up is, hey, can you serve on the board? Like, what's your perspective of why you say, no, that's not a good idea?
Staying professionally neutral. So let's talk about this. When a church hires an attorney for the church, and this is going to be a major key, that attorney is giving legal counsel to the board for the benefit of the church. The church attorney should not also be the pastor's attorney, because if the pastor is doing something that could be detrimental to the church, then that attorney needs to be able to advise the board, even if the pastor sits on the board by chance. You need to be able to advise the board, hey, this is going on, and this could be problematic. It should be addressed. These changes need to be made. And since you're a financial guy, I'm just do finances. Let's do a financial audit of the church's finances. Some things come up that look awry, right? So your third party legal counsel, if the board has hired an attorney for the church, should be advising for the greater good of the church to the board, even if board members are sometimes not the culprit. This sounds so terrible, right? But the person who needs to be viewed in a different light. And so I don't ever want to mix being on the board, fiduciary duties to the board, with the role of being an attorney and a counsel, and the ethical liabilities and obligations I have there. It can just get complicated. So it just needs to be, in my opinion, separate, so that you can give unbiased advice without worrying about hurting feelings or shedding somebody in a negative light. You need to be able to speak the truth freely for the best interest of the church, because that's why you're hired, if you are the attorney representing the church hired by a board to give this type of advice. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point, because I mean, it's one of those things that made me think about, like, when people ask, I mean, and I'll talk about it from like the legal perspective. People ask their outside legal counsel to also be the legal counsel for a minister. It's like, what happens if an issue happens between those two parties? I mean, as we talked before about, hey, pastors should have a contract about what are their duties, what are they being compensated for. And it's just like, if you have the same attorney who is representing the church and representing that's like representing the plaintiff and the defendant in a case where it's just like any
Just
court would probably look at that and say, this is not acceptable.
in a situation where they're on opposite sides of the fence, it doesn't work. For an attorney to represent both parties, like you see when real estate transactions, sometimes the realtor represents both the buyer and the seller, but it's like they have to agree that this is okay. You know what I'm saying? Because whose interest matters most? You're gonna get the seller to make the most money. You're gonna get your buyer to get it for the lowest cost. You can't do both unless all parties agree that, hey, this is fair. We want to save these fees. You know what I'm saying? Let's do it like this. Same thing in the church. Your example of if the pastor and the board get into something and you got the same attorney, well, who am I suing? Right? If I'm the pastor suing the church or the church suing the pastor, I can't represent both. And so because of that, I think it's good to be third party and neutral. I also feel like when you're third party and not all the way vested, I don't know, I'm a direct person anyway. So it's easy to just say, hey, this is what it is. You guys take it or leave it. I'm gonna put this in a memo to y'all. You know what I'm saying? Let you know that I made you aware as a board. Now what you do with it, that's on you. And I don't have to come sit in here every Sunday and look at people and know things. I don't want to know your secrets. I don't want to know like that and still have to worship here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, to me, that makes perfect sense because I was talking to a friend of mine who's an accountant, and he was like, at the church he's a member of, the church kept asking him about, hey, you're an accountant, want to help out. And he was like, what, to be honest with you, there's some things I don't want to know, because especially if you've been an accountant at any organization and you've done accounting for, I would say, at least 3 years, you have probably come across some things that where you're like, you know what? If I were on the other side of this transaction, I would feel a little different. Like, it may not be illegal, it may not be wrong. It's just that, hey, my perspective would change. Like,
Right.
One of the things that, I had a conversation with the pastor, and I'm sure this has probably come up with you, where it's like, especially on the finance side, where churches tend to just get someone in the church to then be in charge of the finances. Then I'm just like, for ministers, one of the things that I would say is, if you're the pastor of the church, if you are making, let's say, very sound, solid decisions for your church. Let's say, for example, the pastor is traveling to go somewhere to, speak at a conference. And let's say he's going to be gone for an extended period of time. And the church, let's say the church, what I have seen is the church doesn't buy him a first class ticket. It's not even a business class ticket. They just get him economy plus. And the person who is a member in the church that's doing the accounting looks at that and says, well, start spreading the rumor that, hey, the church is paying, the pastor is taking advantage of the church, upgrading him. And it's just like, he went from economy to economy. He got 6 inches.
Right. $40. Right.
And it's just like stories like that start to develop to where, like, I advise churches where it's like, hey, maybe you should think twice about having a member have that much access to the information, because there may be something that they see that they misinterpret, but yet they still go share it with other people in the church, which it just causes a problem that you just don't want to have.
And by having a third party, like you said, you eliminate that. And that does matter. You don't need sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so knowing several things, what we're making, increases, raises, expenses. And it's not that anyone's doing anything wrong. And it's not that you just, people in churches, I've seen a lot of times, you don't want your business all over the sanctuary. But you should, and we're not saying get a third party to cover it up, because you should be very clear. The pastor should have a contract, expense allotment. The board needs to know, your accountant needs to know, he needs to be checks and balances so we can get access. But everybody in your ministry doesn't need to know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, it's one of those things where another situation I've seen where something did come up and it wasn't necessarily something was being done wrong. It's just some people in the church had some questions about some stuff. And when they asked the questions, the pastor, stood up, the pastor talked about it. And like it was in a meeting, pastor talked that he explained what was going on. And the people naturally were skeptical. It's like, your explanation works in your favor. Right. And so then they were like, well, we'll get the person that does the records. And the person was a member who really loved the pastor, was loyal to the pastor, to where it's like, even if that person was telling the truth,
Mm-hmm.
because that person is loyal to the pastor, they love their pastor, which I don't think anything is wrong with that. It's just the people who were asking the question, they just didn't feel like they could have confidence that they
Yeah.
were getting an objective answer.
Yeah. And if let me tell you something, pastors. If the folks don't trust you, they won't give. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's the bottom line. And so I think you do need a certain level of transparency. I don't think there's anything wrong with showing end of the year balance sheet, quarterly balance sheet to your congregations, to your tithe paying members, if that's what they need. It's not a secret, but everyone doesn't need to know every nitty gritty. So there's a delicate balance there.
Yeah.
Any
Yeah.
pastor that stands in the pulpit and tells me I'm an open book, you can ask me anything, I immediately don't trust you and think you lying. Because who says that? Now this is Harriet Lampkin talking. This is not Terrell. This is me. I don't believe that. But there is a certain level of transparency that is necessary because you want to show people that you have nothing to hide and you're above board. And so a couple of things happen when folks get greedy. I see a lot more in non-denominational churches. You founded this church. You don't have any real oversight authority on how it's going. This is why your board is important. Who's sitting there? And I tell pastors, if you're starting a nonprofit, whenever you create a nonprofit, you get to select your own board members, right?
Mhm.
So be cognizant that the people that you're putting on your board, one, has knowledge of the things that you need them to have knowledge of. Business operations. You want savvy people who are familiar with doing this type of work, right? Who can approve your contract, who can negotiate with you on what your salary is. But if you're a founder starting your own ministry, let's say I start Harriet and Terrell Church of God in Jesus. I don't want to come for kosher today, right? What we say go is our rules, right? But we're going to put people on the board, and we might sit on the board who don't want us to be penniless, but who also won't let us pat our own pockets to take from the ministry. And it's just a balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I agree, because I think there was something that you mentioned earlier that is a piece of advice that I've had to tell, with churches, is part of having third party counsel when it comes down to like legal and finance, is that you can get more of an objective answer from them. Because let's say if something doesn't look right, a member is less likely to confront or to have a honest conversation with the pastor and say, hey, I probably wouldn't do this, because it's like, you're their pastor. There is a certain level of respect or a position that they hold you in. But when you have a third party, it's just like, hey, if I come to you and I say, hey, I'm looking at the data, here's what the data is telling me, this doesn't look right. Like, you can explain all you want. I'm not a member of your church. I'm just here to give you a honest, objective perspective. Like, I have no conflict of interest in the loyalty. Like, my loyalty is to doing the right thing. And I do think a lot of times ministers, and I get it, because you see it with the board a lot, where they pick people who they believe will co-sign what they're
Oh
trying to
yeah,
do.
absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. We could do a whole segment on that. I'll come back. I'm gonna put a pin drop. I'll come back. Keep going. Keep your thought going.
And I think that, a lot of time, like a lot of the boards or the people who serve on like the deacons or the elders, usually are people who, when you know talk to ministers or you talk to other elders, like, hey, how many people object to, how many people voice a different opinion than the pastor? Most of them are like, well, most of them don't really say anything, to where it's just like,
That's it.
you probably have the wrong people in the board, or maybe the wrong culture has developed, to where I would advise, like, if you are a minister and you have a board that is composed purely of people who don't seem to provide any pushback, I think you are missing out on a great opportunity to have protection from, things that could go wrong, because
Right.
they're not saying anything. And I think in those situations, I've advised people, like, in your situation, you really need outside accounting, you need outside legal, because you need some type of objective perspective that can advise you, because your board seems to be filled with people who all just co-sign on whatever you say, because they like you and they think highly of you, which isn't wrong. It's just you don't have anything that's objective coming to you.
No, I agree. Do not fill your board with yes men. And that's what people, we tend to pick people at times who will not challenge us. The challenge is not to cause you resistance, pastors, and make your job of leading a church harder. It's to change your thinking. It's to think in ways that are strategic to help the church grow, right? And so those things are critically important of the people that you choose. People who are knowledgeable of business. Let me tell you, major key, your church board members does not have to be made up of members of your congregation. They can be other pastors who are doing this and have experience and can give you, if you're a middle-sized church and you want to go to mega church, then you might want to pull a mega church pastor who knows how to do this to sit on your board. You want a diverse board of intellectual thinkers who can help you lead your ministry in the best way possible. And you're not going to get that by just having a bunch of yes men and women.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that becomes a challenging dynamic because, and not to say that, hey, we're just beating up on pastors and ministers, because I mean, it is a challenging dynamic because a lot of times ministers are trying to find like, who are people who, take the vision to heart and really, are going to help the organization move towards the vision and the objective, but also for them to be objective in the process of doing that, to where I think a lot of times, it's easier for ministers to lean towards, well, who has the heart of the vision, and they forget about objectivity. They're just like, well, who just has a heart for the vision, and they end up picking unqualified people to do things. And it's just like, hey, having a heart for the vision is one aspect of it, but if they lack objectivity to give you fair and honest feedback, you're still not going to be able, you're just going to have a bunch of people who believe in the vision, but can't actually help you get there.
That's it. They cannot help you build the vision or move it forward. And that's a waste of everybody's time, especially the souls that the Lord has assigned for you to minister to in your area or region or the nation. And the whole point of what Terrell and I is doing is, I know I can come across as direct and harsh, but we want for you to have successful ministries. We want for your ministry to be the best that it could possibly be. So we give legal advice and financial advice from the perspective of keeping you in compliance with the laws and the IRS, but also maximizing the potential of your ministry so you can do ministry at the next level, whatever that level may be for your congregation. That's it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it is always good to know that, for many ministers, they may be thinking like, well, we want to get outside counsel. Like, hey, we want to get an outside accounting firm or legal counsel. And I will say, it is fair to say that, hey, a lot of accounting and legal firms do not make it known that, hey, we support churches or that we understand churches, because even when I was doing a search for like, hey, who else is out there? Because as I talked about last week, one of the things that we're going to do with the church law and finance is take some of the conversations we're having and turn them into and actually establishing a podcast. And there'll be some interviews with other people that do support churches, because I do think there are a lot of aspects and that you can discuss. Like, last week I had a conversation with a gentleman named Bob Dye, who runs, Good Shepherd bookkeeping for churches out in California. And one of the things about his background is he spent years in working for a financial institution that specializes in providing finances for churches and church planting. And it's just like, that's a whole nother mindset of when you go to seminary, you want to start a church. Now you want to buy a building for $2 million. How do you go about actually, qualifying for a loan? Like, what do you use? Because there are so many people who are trying to think through that. And it's just like, they don't have access to the people, or they're not using the access that they have to start figuring out those real challenging issues like that.
Right. No, that's great. So Terrell and I, locally, if your church has questions, we're here. Right? We're here. Reach out to us. And don't let your budget stop you, because Terrell and I do pro bono stuff. That don't everybody call us for free advice. However, because we're doing this for the kingdom, and we get enough churches who can't afford us but want us, we'll set up a special workshop seminar, and we just come in and spend some time with you to give you some best practices Terrell, you like how I volunteer your time? He's a good guy, so he'll tell you. But we want everybody to be successful in this because we're doing it for the Lord, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I will. I laugh, but I echo that because I do think it is very important. And like I said, I do a similar thing when it comes down to my accounting and finance practice for when we're working with law firms, or where it's just like, hey, we understand everybody is not at the same place. Like you may say, well, my church isn't a mega church. We don't really need outside counsel. Even if it's just to have someone come in and just lay out what are some best practices to put some controls in place to where you may have someone that you hired internally to do it. But the question of it is if you don't know accounting, like, how do you know that they're doing the right thing? And especially if they don't have deep experience in it, then they're probably doing the best that they know how. But if you don't have anyone that can kind of lay out, like, hey, let's do an audit of the processes and just make sure you have some good controls in place, I think at a very minimum, every church should do that. Because what I find a lot of times with churches, and I will say, is like, you may be able to find some of the answers when you Google or you go to YouTube, or let's say you buy a book. You may be able to find some answers when it comes down to some of the accounting and finance stuff. I would highly recommend, do not do that when it comes down to legal. Like, do not
Yes.
rely on a book you read
Yes.
or a Google search,
Don't do it.
because that is how you get into trouble. Now, also on the finance side, if you get into more specific, like tax rules, tax laws, don't rely on your Google search, because your Google search probably there I would say is one of the things you find, that I find a lot when it comes down to tax and it comes down to legal, is there are some very specific exceptions to a lot of the general rules. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to create a problem.
Right. I agree.
And so one of the things that like I said, that Harriet and I have also talked about is creating more checklists with some of the stuff that we've discussed on the show, different topics, are really helping people get some simple checklists. So that will be in the process of working on that and making that, and we'll kind of make that announcement as those become available, where people can download those. Because I do find, and I'm curious on your sentiment, I find that there is a mixture of, there are some people in the church who want to do the right thing and that are open and are like, hey, how do we find the right resources to make sure we're doing the right thing? And then I find a lot of people in the church who are like, well, it hasn't been a problem so far, so we must be okay.
So I see the same. I see it right down the middle. You have folks who think, hey, let's be astute, let's be aware. And then you have the, no, we've been good for 30 years. We're straight. This church been here 60 years. We're good. And times are changing. I'll just say that. If you've not had an issue come up before, thank God for that, right? Scripture also says warning comes before destruction. So if your church has been fine forever, right? Because you didn't know when you were in this blind stage of you weren't aware, and then you tune into Terrell's and our seminars. Nothing happens by happenstance. Now the Lord is making you aware before the thing happens of, hey man, maybe we should go back and check on these. Are we doing this correctly? Maybe your grace is about to run out. So don't rely on it's always been fine. Times change, things change, laws change all the time. So I'll say that, but Terrell, I've seen exactly what you just said. It's split down the middle. Now, especially more in our Black churches, now you got more and more people becoming more educated, not just in academia, but in life, different types of jobs. We are evolving as a people. We're becoming more business savvy. Ministries are businesses, multi-million, billion-dollar industries. They're being more heavily regulated by the government. These things need to be in place. And this goes from the smallest of the churches to the largest of the churches. Let's just do all things decent and in order.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, and it's one of those things that one of the things that I'm gonna try to do is pull in more like say current day news stories about what's going on for non for profits. And I know when I say nonprofit, people are like, well, we're a church, we're a special. One of the things that I see is a lot of the legal and the financial issues that happen to non-religious nonprofits are some very similar issues that I see happen in churches and religious nonprofits, because I do think as people start to get more of a glimpse of, hey, these are some common issues that are happening in nonprofit organizations, when they take a step back and they look at their church, I think a lot of people will start to realize, like, oh, we have that issue too.
Mhm.
And part of the reason I point that out and I emphasize on it strongly is that the IRS is upgrading their systems, they're bringing on new staffing. And one of the things that, people are asking, like, well, are these IRS gonna audit more, ordinary people? And they've said, hey, we're not gonna audit anyone, individuals that make less than 400,000. But one of the things I will remind you is they didn't say that they wouldn't audit more non-for-profit organizations. Like, those are on the list to be reviewed. And part of
Mhm.
that is because there have been a lot of people who have used nonprofit organizations for fraud activity
Mhm.
or for some malicious activity. So, nonprofit and churches, religious organizations do rank high on the list of, hey, these are potentials for fraud and risk. So you could find that there is a higher level of scrutiny placed on nonprofits and churches. And like, our goal is just, hey, bring to light what some of those issues are. And if you find that some of the things we talk about are relevant to you, reach out to us. And, anyone who reaches out to us is confidential, because we don't mention names as we're talking about these situations, because everything is confidential. But I think the goal is to prevent you from falling into a bigger issue than could be if you try to just ignore it.
I agree. And I just to piggyback, because I know we are at time. So what the pandemic has done. So the IRS has staffed up with these folks for auditors. But what the pandemic has done has made the quiet, unknown church known, because everyone had to go virtual. Okay. So now we are streaming our services online. So the church in Timbuktu that no one was aware of, but the people around Timbuktu, now the world knows. And if you don't think the IRS, we're watching, we're watching your ministries. And I've seen from the smallest of the small to the biggest of the big, but there's more. You're not just hidden anymore. Everyone has greater exposure now because of the digital age, and we are now virtual. So every ministry is on the radar now. And before, where they might not have time and didn't know about you, wasn't going to drive over here to see about you. Well, now we just tune in, and if I got 1,000 extra workers, pull up these ministries and see what they're talking about.
Yeah.
What are these people talking about? Are they flashy? What are they doing? What are they saying? Those things are being watched. And this is not hearsay. I know this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I will always say the scrutiny will be much higher on churches, because churches aren't required to file any type of tax return. They're not required to file any formal financial statements with the IRS. So the IRS, churches are a big question mark to
Mm-hmm.
many people in the IRS, and they're looking, like I said, when they see something that they think, hey, maybe a little off, they're like, hey, let's make a special request. Let's look into this more. And it used to just be with mega churches when they were talking about buying things like jets and buying properties. But I think a lot of churches are not prepared that, hey, more people may be looking into your organization. And the question of it is, do you have your things in order to be able to fully substantiate the actions and the decisions that are being made within your church? And we're here to help with that. So I would say thank you again for tuning in this week. Until next time.